So I think pretty much everyone can agree that Fallout is a pretty cool franchise. While the first two games are a bit archaic by today's standards, they're still pretty awesome old school titles. Well, Fallout 2 is anyway. Truth be told, I haven't done much with Fallout 1, but hey, it's pretty similar to its sequel, and that should be a good indication that it's probably solid. I can't comment on Brotherhood of Steel, which I've heard is pretty awful, nor can I comment on Fallout Tactics, which I've heard mixed responses on. But I can comment on Fallout 3. Fallout 3 was the first game I got a platinum trophy on. And yeah, that's nothing too mind-blowing, nor should it be a measure of how awesome a person is. I'm not bragging. Much. Your first response to that is probably, "Ew, you played Fallout 3 on PS3? Yes. Yes, I did. In fact, I actually got the platinum after I got the PC version. Now, before you scream obscenities at me, this was because A, the PC version doesn't much care for my laptop, and B, I was getting rid of the PS3 version at the time, donating it to another person, and I wanted to make sure I had no regrets. I was also going to do that with Fallout New Vegas, but that kept deleting my saves, so I said F that. Now I'm getting a little bit off track. Point is, Fallout 3 was great. I know a lot of the purists of the originals don't care for it for one reason or another. For me, it was my introduction to the series, and damn do I love it. My buddy Shads introduced me to it, telling me it was from the same guys that made Oblivion, another game he had introduced me to. Fallout 3 sent me straight into a nerdibetic coma. I loved the setting. The devastated ruins of the DC wasteland made for an amazing location. I loved the story. My blank slate was enough of my own character to be what I wanted them to be, while still giving me a decent enough core character and story. I was a lone wanderer from Vault 111, searching for my father who had somehow escaped the confines of the underground community. From there, I had so many options. Savior of the Wasteland, Scourge of DC, Jerkwad who stuffs live grenades with the pins pulled into someone's pocket. It was fantastic, and I was infatuated with the game, despite its frequent glitches and irritatingly immortal NPCs. Then I was floored with Fallout New Vegas. While the setting was much less interesting, and I find the core plot to be less engaging, everything else was made so much more involved. I can scarcely mention a more incredible RPG. Now that's not to say I can't think of better RPGs, but in terms of the role-playing part, New Vegas is mind-blowing. So many little actions could have such massive outcomes in New Vegas. You could silence any NPC, take the game's story in any direction, and be whoever you wanted to be. And with it, we got awesome companions and pretty well fleshed out NPCs. To this day, I still frequently find new little aspects that I never noticed before. And now I can combine Fallout 3 and New Vegas with the stellar Tale of Two Wastelands mod. And what an amazing experience that's been providing me. And then there's Fallout 4. Good grief, I don't even know how to label this video, because Fallout 4 is definitely one of those games that kinda has a pretty heavy controversy toward it. I ultimately settled on, is it worth the hype, simply because it is still a super popular game. But I'm not sure I've ever seen a game this well received that also had this much hate directed at it. Now, there will be comparisons to older Fallout titles, but it'll mostly be Fallout 3 and New Vegas, though I may make occasional references to 1 and 2. Also, take note that I'm playing the PS4 version of Fallout 4. Yeah, I know, a Bethesda game on console! Unfortunately, it won't run on my desktop because my graphics card is kinda ancient, and I'm pretty sure my laptop would catch on fire if I tried to play it on there. And to its credit, it's a much, much, much better port than Fallout New Vegas was on the PS3. So the question to answer is Fallout 4 worth the hype? Let's start simple with the game's production values. Graphically, it looks pretty good. It's not as mind-blowing in appearance as some of the current generation's titles, but it's by no means ugly. The character models are decent, though they look a bit simple in certain respects. You can now modify your protagonist's body a little, making them muscular, thin, or a bit on the chubby side, which is a nice addition, but it's a bit bizarre that you still can't change your height. You have about as much customization on your appearance as the previous games in terms of choosable aspects, such as hair and basic elements, but then you're given a considerable amount of customization in terms of shape. You're also given a lot to work with in terms of little touches, freckles, scars, makeup, etc. It's a step up from previous Bethesda titles for the most part. Oh, and also it has hair physics now. Yay! Also, dog meat. He's just so damn adorable in this game. You can even give him goggles and a bandana if you so desire. Once when goofing around, I attempted to make Christopher Reeve. Unfortunately, I wound up making Tyler Hoechlin? The guy who plays Superman on the CW Supergirl. Which was actually kind of funny given how accidental it was. The locations also aren't as detailed as they could be, but the lighting is on point and absolutely gorgeous. The shadow effects look spectacular, and minor effects like getting wet in the rain add to the game's overall visual quality. The audio is mostly good. While a lot of the voice acting is just okay and strangely worse than pretty much every other game in the series, occasionally getting grating, looking at you, Piper, it's nothing too terrible. The sound effects are nice and clear, and the music? Hot damn, this is easily the best soundtrack Fallout has ever had. Perhaps Bethesda has ever had. Yeah, come at me, bro. I like the OST here more than in Skyrim. Fallout 4 begins 200 years before most of the franchise takes place, which is to say the pre-war era. I swear, this game totally stole my idea, since I once had an idea for a Fallout game that began in the same era and had the protagonist be cryogenically frozen, only to awaken in a vault where nobody else was left. Granted, my idea had it be the result of the Enclave abducting everybody for reasons that I hadn't really thought of, and that the player was rescued by an NPC before it happened, but that's neither here nor there. The point is, it's pretty awesome seeing a bit of the game before the nuclear apocalypse. Unfortunately, this is where the first and possibly biggest flaw with the game is. Your player character. In previous Fallouts, you generally had the flimsiest of backstories. You were a vault dweller, you were a tribesman, you were a courier, you were the teenage child of Liam Neeson. Okay, that last one had a little bit more to it, but in general, you were allowed a pretty wide amount of role-playing to the role-playing. Fallout 4's protagonist is either a male war veteran or a female lawyer, married to the other with a newborn infant son. Now, this alone isn't completely breaking, but it's definitely a bit more defined. And it gets worse. Your protagonist is voiced. I think this is probably my biggest gripe with the game. The dialogue system has been severely butchered. You get 4 responses, and we've all heard the meme. You have yes, sarcastic yes, aggressive yes, and more info yes. Much like many of the modern BioWare titles, you'll pick one response and wind up with your character saying something that's nothing like what you intended. Now you might think these mean you get to decide how your character acts still, but not really. You can't be a psychopathic raider. Even when you're a jerk, you're still basically a good person. In fact, you can barely fly off the handle and splatter entire locations across the walls because there's so many damn essential NPCs. That's not even counting the complete removal of the karma system, and the factions are barely relevant because it only applies to the main groups. You don't even really have a choice beyond side with this one or that one. You can't even go things alone. You're railroaded into picking a side whether you want to or not. Is it a deal breaker? Not entirely, but it's definitely something that leaves you feeling a bit more distant from your character. Remember how in Fallout New Vegas, low intelligence left your character being a total dipstick? How each of your skills had an impact on the countless dialogue options, or some of your perks would lead to more interesting, diverse conversations? Yeah, that stuff is all gone. Even Fallout 3 at least had some level of variance with your protagonist's responses based off of your skills or stats. You can still do speech checks in Fallout 4, but honestly, I have yet to see any major impact from these. Speaking of skills, oh boy have they been neutered. Or rather, they're non-existent now. Perks are still around, but are much like Skyrim's, and most wind up being, Deal 20% more damage with the weapon type of your choice. To their credit, the non-combat perks are often kinda neat. I'll discuss some of those a little later. Unfortunately, this means perks are almost entirely tied to their governing attribute, and a perk you can take is upgrading your special stats. Now this in of itself isn't a bad thing. After all, the previous entries had the intense training perk. Of course, that was limited to a maximum of 10 uses, along with a few other augments you might be able to find. This unfortunately bleeds into the quests too, including a good chunk of the main story. There's very, very few instances where you can alter the outcome of a mission other than go here and shoot this guy. Rarely will you be able to do things your own way, and it makes the game feel a bit samey on separate playthroughs. The only real change you get is which faction you side with, and unfortunately, you don't get a unique ending based on your choices for the most part. There's very little variation between them, and it's a pretty glaring weakness after the massive amount of different options you had in Fallout New Vegas. Even Fallout 3 had a decent number of things that would change the flow of the story. And the story itself, it's pretty underwhelming. It has good parts, don't get me wrong. It just never feels like it's your own story being written, and that you're following something fairly on rails with only one real major choice. It doesn't help that there's pretty much only one major twist, and you undoubtedly saw it coming from a mile away. Though if you haven't played the game, I won't spoil it for you. It's perhaps made even worse because the Minutemen are somewhat built up to be this force that defends settlements, and you're supposed to be the de facto leader right off the bat, no less. But you feel like you're just being bossed around by Preston. Imagine how much more interesting it would be if you could send troops to a specific location, and they'd come back with rewards. Instead,
another settlement has sent word that they need our help.
On a more positive note, the companions are pretty likable, and each have their own interesting backstories, personalities, and diverse styles. Except Preston. Nobody likes Preston.
Another settlement has sent word that they need our help.
No, Preston, shut up. You do it, I'm busy. I found Kate and Kiri in particular well written. Now, granted, I don't think they're quite as good overall as Fallout New Vegas' companions, but I do appreciate that you can now unlock their conversations just by playing the game, as opposed to needing specific actions to be performed in a specific order or risk permanently missing character development and their quests. I also find these characters considerably more fleshed out than Fallout 3's companions. Save for maybe Butch.
Tunnel snakes rule!
You can also now romance some of your companions, which I do appreciate. It's something your buddies definitely have over their New Vegas counterparts. It's nothing real special. Basically, you just get a buff when you sleep, as far as I can tell. And it's not as cool as getting hitched in Skyrim, especially with the Hearthfires DLC. But I do like the inclusion of it. It's a shame that none of your companions seem bothered if you try to pork everyone. And the romances are certainly nowhere near as fleshed out as something like Dragon Age or Persona. But it still adds a bit of personality to the cast and allows for a bit of uniqueness. If there's one major gripe I have with companions in Fallout 4, it's this. Oh my god! Will you get the hell out of my goddamn way? Remember how people always complained about Lydia standing in the doorway in Skyrim? Well, it seems like it's not well known, but if you keep pushing an NPC, or if you run into them while dashing, they'll move out of the way eventually. No such luck here. Needless to say, there's been more than a few occasions where I ate damage from something because my idiot teammate became an immovable wall and just stood there looking stupid when I was trying to get out of the way of an attack, or a grenade, or a mine. The new inventory system, however, is wonderfully convenient, being able to specifically decide what your companions equip. Speaking of equipment, another change is equipment no longer degrades. Now, this is something that I'm a bit mixed on. Not sure if I prefer it, or prefer the maintenance done in the previous couple games. Now, up to this point, I've been kinda negative, mostly due to the lack of RP in this RPG. So how's the G part? Well, for all the flaws Fallout 4 has, the combat isn't one of them. Well, save for the pre-mentioned aspects, but besides that, it vastly improves on a lot of fronts, most of them really. Combat is faster and smoother than ever, making fights feel tense and exciting, Aiming in particular feels more on point than the previous entries, particularly with the iron sights, which I felt kinda sucked in Fallout New Vegas. Third-person aiming still has the little aiming dot, and it feels that it's just precise enough to work. Aiming through a rifle scope has also been redone, and now you can hold your breath to steady your aim at the cost of AP. Melee combat, however, doesn't seem quite as good as the previous games, despite giving you 2 different standard melee attacks. But the game's movement is quicker, particularly with the ability to dash by using up your AP, making closing gaps easier. I also love the fact that you can melee attack with your guns now. At the cost of AP once again, you can close range smack a foe, which is ideal for setting up a moment to aim or taking down lesser enemies like radroaches. VATS has also been redone. No longer does it stop combat completely to aim. Instead, the game slows down while you set up your shot. I'm a bit indifferent to this change. On one hand, it leaves you more open for counterattack, but on the other hand, it also makes things feel a bit more exciting. Unfortunately, you can no longer use grenades or other throwable projectiles in VATS. They're now thrown by a button press. The upside to this is you can toss a grenade without switching weapons, which is pretty nice. The quick slot inventory has also been redone. Rather than having 8 or 9 slots, you have 4 rows, but each row has a few in its line. I think this is an improvement overall, but it can be annoying when you're trying to switch and you forget to hit confirm. Speaking of inventory, food has been made so much better. I'll discuss one aspect now and another part of it later. It retains the heal overtime aspect from New Vegas, but you recover more quickly, and eating meals has extra effects similar to the Elder Scrolls Online. These little buffs are awesome and make it worthwhile using them instead of just spamming stim packs outside of the survival mode, which I can't and won't comment on because it's not my kind of thing, but I imagine these little improvements make survival mode a bit more bearable. For that matter, stim packs got a pretty substantial alteration. They now heal over time, though quickly, but you have to sit through a use animation. I also love the fact that you can stim pack your downed AI partners and get them back in the fight. It helps make your AI partners feel more useful and more reliable, while still making them partially reliant on you. Again, it makes the game feel more tense in fights, since you can no longer wait to heal until the last moment. Now, probably the biggest addition to the game is the ability to build settlements. This might be my favorite aspect of the game, and was ultimately what made the game click for me. I love the settlement system. I love the fact that all the worthless junk that had no real reason to exist in the previous games beyond maybe a generic fetch quest or 2, and just decoration, is now useful. You find junk, break it down, and build yourself a little shanty town. Set up a beacon, recruit new settlers, and have the settlers farm and run stores or even set up supply lines between other settlements. Then you set up stuff like water sources and defenses, arm your town, etc. It's fantastic. The best part? It's entirely optional, save for one specific instance in the main story, which admittedly is a bit of an annoyance, especially since it can be obnoxious having to find just the right resources. But beyond that one glaring moment, you aren't required to do any of the settlement stuff. This is also where the previously mentioned non-combat perks mostly get to shine. The majority of the perks that you get that don't make you a god of destruction allow you to create new aspects to your little town, and it's probably the closest the game gets to really doing the role-playing aspect. It's also fairly convenient when it comes to building. You can either throw together a quick shack using prefabs or go hog wild and build whatever awesome structure you feel like. Downside is, you do have a limit to how much you can build, and while I don't have hard evidence of this, it does seem to make the load times a bit worse, at least on console. Still, I adore this aspect of the game, and it allows for a lot of creativity. Equipment has also gotten a bit of a once-over, with you being able to equip different armor pieces depending on your clothes. I both like and dislike this. You still have your standard armors, a base defense boost, or you can mix and match various pieces on top of clothing. This is the part I dislike. Different clothing don't allow you to wear armor pieces on top of them, with only some allowing this. I have no idea why this was done, but it's really annoying. But there is an awesome alternative, and I hope Bethesda keeps it. this game's awesome crafting system. Much like crafting your settlements, you can also craft different equipment and items, the first of which is food. As said before, you can craft useful meals for healing and level buffs. In settlements, and a few other places, you can cook up meals, and this makes the various minor food items useful. Find a slice of Brahmin meat, cook that into a massively healing meal. Those red roaches and mole rats you find everywhere, dinner for a quick boost on the battlefield. Dirty water and a mirelurk egg, guess who's having an omelet for breakfast? The only downside to this is that you have access to pretty much all the recipes from the get-go. The game could have benefited from making you learn how to cook, either by some kind of leveling system or by perks. This is another place where the eliminated skill system could have really shined. You can also craft new equipment, both armor and weapons. Or rather, you can craft mods for them. Strangely enough, you can no longer craft ammunition, something that was in Fallout New Vegas, and felt like a prelude to this title's crafting. You also have perks that allow you to craft fancier gear. Again, a nice aspect of this. The mods are about what you'd expect. Higher accuracy, more damage, higher defense. My personal favorite is the Ballistic Weave, which allows you to upgrade simple clothing into something that is more bulletproof than actual power armor. The annoying thing is that you can permanently miss the ability to craft this amazing upgrade, and they have to do missions for a specific faction to get it. Thankfully, you don't have to stay with that faction in order to get the mod, and you can get it from a side quest or two. Also on the subject of power armor, since I mentioned it, holy crap did they upgrade it! It's no longer just fancy armor. Instead, it's, well, power armor. You actually do need a specific fuel source for it, and it acts like a special shell of sorts. It's basically a small-scale mech suit, and you can upgrade, swap, and repair parts of it, which is pretty awesome. Admittedly, if you just do things straight up and immediately follow Wadsworth's instructions to find the Minutemen,
Another settlement has sent word that they need our help.
you can get it within just a few minutes of starting the game. It's a cool set piece, sure, but it also feels like you haven't earned it yet either. It also negates falling damage and most radiation, making it a bit more impressive than just being heavy armor. It actually does feel like what power armor probably should conjure. Speaking of radiation, I actually really loved the change to rads in this game. In the previous games, you were unlikely to ever suffer from radiation sickness for long unless you went out of your way to do so. In this game, many things cause radiation damage beyond just food and a few spots, so it builds up more over the course of the game. But the biggest effect is that it reduces your maximum HP until you cure it. Radaway also seems to be a little less common this time around, meaning you don't want to spam it as much. Another thing I found is, Fallout 4 is surprisingly stable. It's a lot less buggy than I was expecting. Now, don't read that the wrong way, it's still glitchy. I've just found that the game has fewer game-breaking issues than some of the previous entries. Now, this may be because I got the game a long time after release, so a good chunk of issues may have already been cleared up, but most of the problems I've witnessed are the game getting stuck in load screens or physics bugs. And because I've amassed a decent amount of hilarity regarding the physics, and a few other things, here's a montage!
I have to go now. My planet needs me.
Nope.
This one's good.
Step over to the table, take a seat. Just this way.
I have to go now. My planet needs me.
Now, I'd undoubtedly piss off some people if I didn't address a certain aspect of the series. The lore. Now, I personally don't care too much about the lore, at least for the most part. I am actually a little frustrated at how the Brotherhood of Steel is depicted in the game, mind you. I'm upset that basically everything that happens in Fallout 3 is essentially swept under the rug in Fallout 4's history, despite being directly, albeit minorly, related to it. And before you go, but they never acted like the good guys outside of Fallout 3. It was justified in that game. Lion's Brotherhood was an outlier, an exception to the rule, something several members within, as well as the outcasts, would remind you of on more than one occasion in that game. But as for the more heavy-duty lore, which was likely ignored in Fallout 3 as well, I don't know, I'm at least distantly aware that Fallout 4 ignores some of the established stuff. Something that undoubtedly upsets many longtime fans of the franchise. As for me personally, beyond a few nitpicky things, it doesn't bother me too much. But I do get how it might piss off someone and make them tear out their hair. There's also the game world and setting. I like the fact that it's in another massive destroyed city like Fallout 3 was, but it feels a bit too clean. Well, it's still grungy and everything, but it's so bright and colorful, and it doesn't feel as devastated as the DC wasteland. And I never felt like even the settlements came off like a slum-like area struggling to get on its feet. I feel like darker colors may have benefited to that. The game does have some nice weather effects, with stuff like rain and fog occasionally popping up, which adds to the diversity. I also like the addition of radiation storms, requiring you to take shelter or rest, or suffer gaining rads. I do find them a bit irritating when my radiation level increases when I'm inside a shanty house, though. Now you might be asking, how come you're not talking about the DLC? Or, why not talk about mods? Well, there's a few reasons for that. The first being, I haven't done much with Fallout 4's DLC yet. I may do a review of the DLC at some point, I don't know. Plus, the base game should probably be able to stand on its own before talking about the DLC, unless it's a really substantial change to the core game. As for mods, same thing. The game should be able to stand on its own. Plus, like I said, I'm personally playing the PS4 port, so I'd only have a limited access to mods. Of course, if you're playing on PC, or even console to a degree, I definitely suggest finding mods that you like. Mods are an incredible aspect of Bethesda titles, and in most cases, I use them after playing through a title from them at least once in vanilla, or mostly vanilla. And I have no doubt that Fallout 4 has some absolutely stellar mods beyond the typical unofficial patches and bug fixes. You may also wonder what my thoughts on the Creation Club are. A halfway decent idea in theory, but an absolutely abysmal execution. I'd rather see modders get paid by way of a Patreon or donations via Nexus mods or something. I'd certainly consider if I weren't inept at using online currency and wasn't more paranoid than Batman. And many modders absolutely are deserving of receiving compensation for their efforts. However, I don't want to get too far into that controversy, so I'll end my thoughts on it here. So in the end, was Fallout 4 worth its hype? Yes, but no. If you're a fan of RPGs or Fallout, you may find yourself a bit underwhelmed. If you just want a fancy open-world shooter, I think it fits the bill pretty well. I'm somewhere in between, and find it to be a good game, but a poor RPG and not a great Fallout. If I'm being honest, it feels more like a single-player, more realistic Borderlands than it does Fallout. So many of the things that made the past entries great were sacrificed to make something that doesn't quite feel like Fallout. I don't think Fallout 4 is worth the hype, but I don't think it's worth as much hate as it also gets. It's an enjoyable game, and it's good for what it is, but it still left me wishing for something more. I do recommend at least trying it, however, preferably on PC, of course, but with the recognition that it falls a bit short of being a typical Fallout game, and it falls flat as an RPG. But as a post-apocalyptic open-world shantytown simulator shooter, yeah, there's plenty of fun to be found there. Just don't go anywhere near Preston.
Another settlement has sent word that they need our help.
Ugh. Thank you guys so much for watching my review, whether you agree with me or not. You're awesome, you know that? And you'll be even more awesome if you watch some of my other reviews, or maybe one of my playthroughs. By the way, another settlement needs your help.